Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, the Florida State Seminoles, sound like they're gearing up to make a massive push in the transfer portal, hosting a ton of visitors out of the transfer portal this weekend in Tallahassee. Want to talk about some of the names that are on campus or will be on campus. Talk about some of those names that really stuck out to me as really quality additions for this Florida State program, and also want to address the narrative that you see floating around social media and on ESPN that because Mike Norvell and this Florida State program have been aggressive in the transfer portal, that has hurt their culture within the locker room, right? And obviously citing all the opt-outs that Florida State had in the Orange Bowl. And Florida State fans know this. I don't need to tell them this. The opt-outs you saw in the Orange Bowl had zero to do with a poor culture or using the transfer portal too much for this Florida State program. It had to do with a lot of other things that Florida State fans certainly know about. You look at this Florida State team in 2023, there's one thing you're not going to question, and that's the culture within this locker room, the culture that Mike Norvell has created in Tallahassee. So yes, like any other program that's trying to win a national championship and conference championships, you're going to see Florida State use the transfer portal, and it's certainly not going to be at the expense of the culture within that locker room, because it's one of the best cultures that exists in college football. Now, I want to get into the names. Before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. This has been a program that many of you guys know I love talking about. The amount of support from the Florida State fans has been absolutely amazing. Cannot thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the updates, enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And it sounds like later this weekend, we'll have some commitments to talk about as well. So we'll be breaking those down as well. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into some names that really stood out to me. Now, I'm not covering every single visitor for Florida State because they are hosting a lot of visitors, but I want to highlight some of the names that I think would be really good additions for this Florida State roster in 2024. And the first position group I want to go to is that off-ball linebacker position, because you look at what they're going to lose, guys like Jaylen Deloach, Tatum Bethune, obviously DJ Lundy to the transfer portal. That was a lot of experience at that linebacker position that Florida State's going to need to replace. And you saw some flashes from some of those young linebackers in the bowl game against Georgia, but you also saw a lot of inexperience. And for Florida State heading into 2024, you want to make sure that you have a floor at the linebacker position. And if some of these young linebackers make that jump and are able to win some starting spots, then you feel good. But you don't want to go into next year in 2024 relying on all that youth to make those massive progressions. So you want to add a veteran linebacker or two to just provide some depth in that floor of play at that position. The first guy I want to talk about, Nikhai Green, and many of you guys know as a Michigan fan, very familiar with Nikhai Green, and a player that was really awesome for Michigan. And the reason he transfers from Michigan is Michigan hit on a really good linebacker in the transfer portal. They hit on a really good young linebacker on the high school recruiting trail. And Nikhai Green just saw his snap count kind of get diminished in that 2022 year. It had nothing to do with Nikhai Green not being a Power 5 starter at that linebacker position. He transfers to Charlotte, has a phenomenal year, 73 tackles, 9 tackles for a loss, 2 sacks. And for a guy like Nikhai Green, I think it's the perfect addition for Florida State in that linebacker room. Because you bring him in, he is certainly going to be a very solid linebacker for Florida State in 2024. And he also represents a chance for some of those young linebackers to certainly push him for starting opportunities. But you know that if those young linebackers beat out a guy like Nikhai Green, they're ready to play Power 5 football. So if you're Florida State, a guy like Nikhai Green, who I think is a very, very good football player that can go sideline to sideline, he's very physical in the tackle box, would be a very nice addition to the depth of that linebacker room. The next guy I want to talk about also at that linebacker spot, and a little bit more of an intriguing prospect, is Stephon Thompson coming over from Syracuse. And I say intriguing because he's a guy that's bounced around a lot. He played 257 snaps as an edge rusher and then 142 as that off-ball linebacker. And if you were to ask me who would I prefer, Stephon Thompson or Nikhai Green, I think Nikhai Green right now is the better off-ball linebacker, the more reliable off-ball linebacker, because he's played more off-ball linebacker than Stephon Thompson. Now, Stephon Thompson is exciting because, one, looking at some of the numbers, he didn't miss a single tackle for Syracuse in that 2023 season, and he's a phenomenal blitzer. And you know that they're going to look to send linebackers. Jaylen Deloach, one of the best blitzing linebackers in the country last year. In terms of what Florida State wants to do and how they want to play with their linebackers, sending them on some blitzes, Stephon Thompson, with all that pass rush experience coming from Syracuse, wouldn't be a bad addition there. If you're asking me for what Florida State needs, I'm probably going to Kyle Green over Stephon Thompson. And that's not to say that they don't grab both of them in the transfer portal. And then you suddenly feel really good about the experience and depth you have at that linebacker position. Now, the next position I want to talk about, and this was a position we spent a lot of time talking about throughout the year as probably being that one position group that wasn't national championship caliber for Florida State, right? You looked at that offense and said quarterback, massive check when Jordan Travis was healthy. Trey Benson, arguably the best running back in the country. The wide receivers with Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, Jaheim Bell, that was a massive check. That one position group that you said would hold Florida State back potentially was that offensive line. They're going to look to kind of add some depth and talent and some upside to that group. It wasn't a bad offensive line by any means. You don't go 13-0 with a horrible offensive line. But I do think it's a unit that can take some steps heading into 2024. A guy like Terrence Ferguson, expected on campus later this week, would be a massive addition in terms of grabbing upside at the position. A former top 100 national recruit out of the state of Georgia, started one game for Alabama, but that was not again, kind of going to that Nikhil Green argument. A guy like Terrence Ferguson wasn't not starting because he's not a good football player. He actually was pushing for a lot of reps during fall camp and during that early part of the 2023 season. It was more that Alabama had one of the better offensive lines that you saw in the country, especially in terms of getting that run game going. And you look at Florida State, where they struggled the most. They struggled to move some bodies, to win at the point of attack on the offensive line. 6'4", 320-pound interior offensive lineman. A guy like Terrence Ferguson, one, I think could be an immediate starter for Florida State, but two, add some of that physicality to that offensive line. I think this would be a massive addition for Florida State. Now, the next position I want to talk about, in a name that has not locked in an official visit, but a name that Florida State is going after, is Penny Boone, the running back from Toledo. And this is one of my favorite prospects that's available in the transfer portal. And as a Michigan fan, this kid's from Detroit, Michigan, was hoping Michigan would extend an offer to Penny Boone. And the reason I love Penny Boone's fit for Florida State so much is you look at the running backs that they have coming back. A guy like Lawrence Tuafili, you know how excited I am about him and what he can do in space and being kind of that dynamic back in the passing game as a perimeter back, but maybe not a running back that you want carrying the football 20 times a game between the tackles. And the beauty of Trey Benson, he was kind of the best of both worlds, right? He was one of the best running backs in the country because he checks all the boxes, right? Lawrence Tuafili checks a lot of boxes, but he checks a lot of boxes as being more of a perimeter back. A guy like Penny Boone, I think, would go a long way in terms of balancing that backfield. You're looking for your bruiser back. That's Penny Boone. And you take a look at what he did in that 2023 season. Was a transfer from Maryland, wound up at Toledo, 194 carries for 1,400 yards, averaged 7.2 yards per carry, 15 touchdowns, over 50 more missed force tackles. 822 of those yards came after contact. They call him the baby bus. They call him a baby bus for the reason. Like 6'1", 240, extremely downhill, extremely physical, absorbs contact. I wouldn't even say absorbs contact. He gives out contact. He is an extremely physical running back. And you look at that one box that a guy like Lawrence doesn't check, it's probably the physicality in that running back room. Penny Boone would check that in a massive way. And you look at that running back room and how they would balance each other out. That would be a really nice addition to this Florida State running back room, a position that they want to add depth and talent to. Because you lose Trey Benson to the NFL draft, you lose a few of those running backs that you liked to the transfer portal. Penny Boone would be a very nice veteran running back addition for this Florida State roster. Next position group that Florida State seems to be kicking around a little bit is that wide receiver position. And obviously you lose a guy like Keon Coleman, you lose a guy like Johnny Wilson, Jaheim Bell, some of your major targets at that wide receiver position. And you're excited about some of the young wide receivers you have. I think Tron played a really, really good bowl game. Obviously, Hakeem Williams, Destin Hill. You're excited about those guys, but what's the one thing they don't check? They don't check a ton of experience. And so what you're looking for Florida State is maybe to add an experienced wide receiver that's played a lot of football at the college football level that comes in and kind of supplements the young, inexperienced, but very talented wide receiver room with a veteran presence that's going to create separation and get open. And that's exactly what Jabari Barber is. At Troy last year, 75 catches, 999 yards, 416 of those yards came after contact or after the catch, 44 first down catches. When Troy needed a play to happen, right? It was 3rd and 6. It's a big play. You need a playmaker to create some separation and get open and make a catch. Jabari Barber was that guy. And that's kind of, if Florida State, you're looking for who is going to be that guy in this Florida State offense next year. And I think Jabari Barber would go a long way in elevating the floor of what this wide receiver room looks like. And this is kind of how I view the transfer portal, or the best aspect of the transfer portal, right? When you have a lot of young talent, but you don't have a ton of experience, normally you couldn't get experience. Now with the transfer portal being such a factor in college football, you can go out and get an experienced player to add that to a young position group. And I think Jabari Barber certainly would do that for Florida State. The other wide receiver that is kind of interesting that Florida State seems to be trending for is former top 100 national prospect from that 2023 class, Jaylen Brown. And many Florida State fans that have followed recruiting for the last couple of years remember this name. He was one of the fastest players in that 2023 class, another Michigan target that I was hoping would come to Michigan. 10-6 100-meter dash time, didn't record a catch for LSU in that 2023 season, but you betting on the upside. Like at a certain point, you can't cover speed. And Jaylen Brown will be one of the fastest, if not the fastest player on the football field for Florida State in 2024. And when you have a guy that is absolute burners, like you got to try to add him. And a guy like Jaylen Brown would be a massively exciting addition. And if they land Jaylen Brown, I think they still go after a guy like Jabari Barber to add some experience to that room. But if they add Jaylen Brown, you start talking about Hakeem Williams, Jaylen Brown, Destin Hill as 3 guys that are going into their second year of college football, and you have a guy like Brock Glenn and Luke Cromno coming in the ranks, you're really excited that quarterback wide receiver room looks like, not only in the 2024 year, but in 2025 and potentially 2026 as well. So for Florida State, I would keep an eye on him. And the last guy that hasn't played much, kind of similar to Jaylen Brown, but a guy that was really exciting coming out of high school was Earl Little Jr., right? Coming from American heritage, obviously the connections with Pat Surtain on Florida State's coaching staff. This is a box checker. And Earl Little is a guy that didn't play for Alabama, but when you look at Alabama's roster and kind of get the explanation of, why did Earl Little not find the football field the first 2 years? I mean, Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry, the 2 boundary cornerbacks for Alabama the last 2 years, those guys are going to be first-round NFL draft picks, both of them. So you're like, Earl Little Jr. might be a guy that was a highly talented kid coming out of high school. Sounds like he was a bust because he didn't play the first 2 years at Alabama. That's not the case. I mean, it's just hard to get on the football field when you have 2 first-round NFL draft picks that have kind of stayed healthy and locked down those 2 cornerback positions for Alabama. You look at Florida State, they're losing a lot of talent in that cornerback room. Earl Little Jr. probably comes in and competes for a starting spot immediately. And again, the thing that you're talking about is a box checker, right? He has the frame, he has the athleticism to be a phenomenal cornerback at the college football level. Now, Florida State has a lot more visitors that are on campus or that will be on campus. I wanted to highlight some of my favorite, more intriguing prospects for Florida State. I think the next couple of days we'll have a lot to talk about in terms of Florida State potentially landing some of these commitments. Excited to do so. Florida State fans, cannot thank you guys enough for rocking with the boys. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll be back more with some updates for Florida State in the transfer portal. Appreciate you guys rocking with it, and we'll talk to y'all later.